What began in June 2024 as a space to amplify autistic and neurodivergent voices has grown into something far bigger. A platform for raw, honest conversations about neurodivergence, disability, burnout, inclusion, mental health, and how our identities shape the way we move through the world. From the start, our mission has been clear: to go beyond the headlines, beyond stereotypes, and explore the real lived experiences that often go unheard. Over the past year, we've spoken with parents, professionals, educators, advocates, and everyday people, all united by a commitment to building a more inclusive and accessible world. But what's mattered most is the community. Those of you who listen, share, and remind us, finally, someone gets it. Thank you for being here. This is just the beginning.
Looking for authentic conversations that go beneath the surface? Tune in now to the Deep Dive podcast. Visit us at www.deepdiveau.net. That's deepdiveau.net. And follow us across your favorite platforms: YouTube, Instagram, LinkedIn, TikTok, and Facebook. Just search at the Deep Dive AU. Join us as we dive deep into stories of neurodivergence, lived experience, and creating a more inclusive world. The Deep Dive podcast. Conversations that matter. Stories that connect.
This is the Deep Dive podcast. And here is your host, Michael Coles.
Tracy King is the founder and CEO of InspireEd, a strategic consulting and learning design agency known for helping mission-driven organizations build sustainable, impactful, and revenue-generating learning programs. With over a decade of experience in learning strategy, instructional design, and workforce development, Tracy leads InspireEd in empowering associations, corporations, and training organizations to transform their education portfolio through thoughtful strategy, inclusive design, and pragmatic AI enablement. Their approach blends cognitive science, accessibility, and neuroinclusion to design learner-centered experiences that deliver measurable growth and competitive advantage. Under Tracy's leadership, InspireEd has become a trusted partner for organizations seeking to modernize learning programs without losing sight of human-centered purpose. And Tracy is recognized as a thought leader in professional learning and inclusive education. Tracy King, welcome to the Deep Dive.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
So what does neuroinclusion look like in a professional development or continuing education context? And how does it differ from simply accessibility?
That's a great question. I have a few thoughts. The first is that neuroinclusion acknowledges that part of being biologically diverse means that naturally brain and nervous system differences exist among us, right? So right now, as best we understand them, we're clustering those differences under the neurodivergent umbrella way of being. And as examples of neurotypes that we frequently talk about in learning are autism, ADHD, the combination of those two, affectionately called ADHD, and learning differences like dyslexia. So neuroinclusion also acknowledges that there are levels of complexity within those neurotypes that exceed accessibility. So each of these has varying support needs, and support needs are dynamic in neurodivergence, meaning that they can change day to day, depending on a host of factors like sensory sensitivity or overwhelm. And in addition to that, some neurodivergent individuals do identify that their level of disadvantage qualifies or is a disability. They do identify as being disabled, and others don't. Others don't describe their experience that way. And so there's an identity component to neurodivergence. And this is something also that we see in the research that shifts over time, over one's life, because neurodivergence does become more challenging as we age. In addition to that, neurodiversity is in many instances a non-apparent disability or a non-apparent disadvantage, which means that when you look at me, you don't necessarily, right immediately clock me as autistic. The differences that many of us have because they're brain and nervous system oriented aren't necessarily visibly apparent. You might notice it more when I'm dysregulated, if I'm fidgeting or.
Me too. You'll need both.
But to create inclusive and welcoming learning spaces, we have to we have to think broader than just addressing disadvantages that we can see, right? So that we're talking about communication norms, allowing for movement for nervous system regulation, mining sensory sensitivities in spaces, so a lot of space considerations, as well as thinking about how we understand executive function challenges and the choices that we can make in design around that. One final thought I'll offer is that neuroinclusion also acknowledges that adaptations that we make in learning or otherwise benefit most learners, but are essential to some. And so that right there is reason enough that we want to implement them.
Okay, so what is the business case for embedding neuroinclusive practices into workforce development, and what are the benefits for organizations and learning portfolios?
I think first we have to acknowledge that at least 1 in 5 people are neurodivergent. And so there are several reasons for us to believe that it's even more than that, given the structural issues in gaining diagnosis, who are more or less likely to actually gain access to diagnostics, and all of that kind of thing. So we believe that it's more than 20% of the workforce, or and any given day in an adult classroom, at least 20% of our learners are going to be disadvantaged, likely more. And so we have to think about whether we're okay with that. But in terms of advantages, neuroinclusion and workforce development has a huge upside. When we are more inclusive in workforce development, we see reduction in turnover. We see reduction in unemployment for neurodivergent professionals are able to maintain employment, and that is a problem in the neurodivergent population. We see improved worker engagement across the board, but noticeably for neurodivergent professionals. We see a decrease in the necessity to rely on sick time and leave in order to manage the harms and the disadvantages of masking when adjustments are welcomed, right, and provided for. And we also see that organizations that are neuroinclusive attract and maintain expertise that they would otherwise miss out on, because neurodivergent professionals are divergent thinkers. They're more innovative. They're significantly more entrepreneurial than the general population. And these are competencies that organizations need right now to meet this moment. Revolutionary change happening in the workforce, right?
Exactly. So what are the common inadvertent barriers that neurodivergent learners face in standard professional development programs?
This is a great question, because there are barriers that are neurotype specific. And with universal design for learning and its multiple means strategies, that can help us bridge some of those anticipated gaps. Like, for example, we know that dyslexic individuals need learning and working environment and materials supports. We know that ADHD learners are motivated entirely differently, and they require structures that support focus and attention. For autistic learners, we know we need to pay attention to learning structures. We need to pay attention to environments and also social norms to set them up for success. And these are items that are, specific learning strategies that we can make part of our comprehensive design checklist. But I want to say a common inadvertent barrier that neurodivergent learners face across learning contexts is that people don't really understand what the diagnostic criteria mean from our perspective, which leads to a tragic misunderstanding of neurodivergence as people. The criteria are framed in a way that that expresses how neurodivergent people break neurotypical norms or inconvenience neurotypical people, right? There's an Australian autism assessor. Her name is Dasha. Her website is called While You Wonder. And she has brilliantly written what the different criteria for autism would look like if someone who is autistic expressed it from their point of view. It's really worth checking it out. But as an example, that the DSM-5 criteria say that autistic people have social deficits, right? But in actuality, we just socialize and communicate differently. And the way that we socialize isn't deficit when we're engaging with each other, right? It's a communication breakdown when neurotypical folks and autistic folks aren't meeting each other, right? Aren't meeting neurotypical expectations. And so there's a lack of understanding that goes both ways. So it's really important for us to think about when we're thinking about neurodivergent folks, like how our concepts about neurodiversity are framed, because if it's from that deficit point of view, then there are likely some misunderstandings that are inherent in how we prepare learning, how we instruct them, how we include or don't include them in learning spaces.
Okay, so how can organizations encourage neurodivergent professionals to disclose their learning and support needs safely?
First, you have to be a safe space. Neurodivergent folks don't disclose because we know that even without seeing the statistical data that substantiates it, that if we disclose that we have support needs, we're more likely than not to experience further bias and discrimination. So when neurodivergent folks don't disclose, they've weighed that risk and they've decided it's not worth it. But we have to realize that the trade-off of masking, is a health jeopardy. So it's not an easy matter to take on harm to not be further harmed. Right?
Yeah, that makes
Either
sense.
way, there's some harm. So we need to understand that it's the responsibility of the organization to provide safety. The second thing I really want people to understand is that there's a large number of neurodivergent professionals in the workforce that do not know that they're neurodivergent. They know they're different. They see that they struggle with things that other people don't. They probably gaslit themselves into like try harder, work harder, and they may not connect with the fact that their chronic inflammation or migraines or health problems are actually related to that, because that's masking. This is particularly true in the U.S. for women, for people of color, for queer folks who have either been misdiagnosed or not screened at all, right? And it's a problem. So if these professionals don't have a framework for understanding their neurodifferences, they can't self-advocate, they can't disclose, but they're still at risk as much as their colleagues who have self-discovered or been diagnosed. And so it's important that we just create neuroinclusive learning by design, and we don't require disclosure in order to provide support.
So, what are some small intentional tweaks in learning events or course design that can significantly improve engagement for neurodivergent individuals?
I have created a design framework, and so if you imagine a matrix, and on top there's 4 columns: one for learning spaces, one for speakers, one for materials, and one for measurement. We can brainstorm best practices in each of those columns against some of the common cluster challenge areas for neurodivergent folks. And the first one is sensory sensitivities. So in our spaces, how are we using color, lighting, for sure no strobing, ambient noise, volume, smells, like sensory comforts? All of those things can either make space safe or inflame some sensory sensitivities. We can prepare speakers with strategies for how they present, for their interaction design, for their slide design. We can think about how to minimize distractions in materials. We can think about the typography and pacing and screen customization and WCAG, right? When we're talking about measurement, we can talk about allowing test takers access to supports, to comfort items, to environments that support them, right, and their sensory sensitivities. And so there are ways for us to brainstorm really common tactics that we might already in some ways be including, but perhaps not consistently, because we just didn't know that they were important for supporting neurodivergent learners. It's not like an above and beyond thing. The other clusters that I encourage people to think about across that matrix are executive function challenges, and then thinking through norms, like social norms, communication norms, behavior norms.
Okay, so how can learning leaders scale neuroinclusive design practices across large or geographically dispersed learning portfolios without prohibitive cost or complexity?
Yeah, this is a tricky question. The most effective way is to design from the margins. That's a concept that I picked up from Ludmila Prislova's book, the canary code. I love it. I love that as an image for a way of thinking about designing from the start to be both accessible and inclusive. It still allows for deeper support needs to be submitted for adaptation, but by doing so, you significantly reduce the time and cost related to rework course materials or arbitrating whether or not learner needs get to be met or not with intervention once they do disclose supports. But I think we need to think about the fact that, yes, right now, the way things are, accessibility and inclusion costs money, but that's because our systems and our norms and our institutions aren't set up for everyone to belong. We aren't set up for everyone to access and to learn. This is an institutional problem, right? Barriers are in the design, not in the people. And so when we prioritize that everyone belongs in our learning spaces from the very start, then the cost of access isn't an issue to us, right? And so there's a little bit of a flip of perspective that we really need to be thinking through, because by not addressing these systems and norms that inherently exclude, then we're perpetuating that exclusion, and that has a price too.
Yeah. So, what metrics and indicators should organizations track to assess whether their neuroinclusive workforce development efforts are truly effective?
You know, there's a couple ways we can look at this when we're thinking about general metrics for an organization. For example, perhaps this organization has decided to be dedicated to neuroinclusion in the workplace and offering neuroinclusive training. We want to look at the retention rates of employees, performance and promotion rates among neurodivergent employees. We want to look at employee engagement and sentiment, right? We might want to do some year-over-year bias benchmarking. There are some studies that compare how managers, colleagues, and neurodivergent employees perceive the treatment of neurodivergent employees in the workplace, and we can see some gaps between perception and actuality from a neurodivergent employee's perspective, and that really gives us some insights into where the work is, so that we can provide better understanding, psychological safety for everyone, right? We can measure satisfaction with the supports that are offered, and we can measure efficacy of ongoing neurodivergence, training for everyone at the workplace, right? From a learning perspective, we want to look at whether neurodivergent perspectives are included in design and implementation. We can look at completion rates, learning performance, which would include like application of the concepts, transfer is what we call that. And in the evaluations, I'd like to ask for feedback about how the design and the support structures that were baked into it performed for learners, and what else might be effective, to really seek specific feedback about the design. And it can be anonymous until there's disclosure safety, right? Anyone can offer their feedback on those supports, but to actively seek feedback about that so that we can continue to improve.
Okay, so in what ways can AI enable or hinder neuroinclusive professional learning experiences, and how should learning leaders think about integrating AI in a neuroinclusive way?
Well, I'm going to talk about it specifically from a learning perspective, because that's a big old topic right there, Michael.
Exactly. And I think we've already covered it on one of the previous episodes. So yeah, so we've actually covered that. So it's an interesting topic in itself.
Definitely. From a learning perspective, we can see that there's still a lot of bias and discrimination that's baked into, LLMs, large language models. So when we're drawing content from them, that means that humans still have to remain vigilant to ensure that content is accurate and bias-free. I know that educators are using AI to brainstorm options for their multiple means strategy for different lessons and exercises, and that can be useful. But again, we need to be able to distinguish what learning strategies are best practice approaches, especially for neurodivergent individuals, learners, because GPTs aren't instructional designers. But I think as AI matures, we're going to see proprietary LLMs that are compiling vast amounts of vetted expert content that learners will be able to call upon and dynamically assemble learning experiences that are adapted to their way of being. It's going to be extraordinarily powerful. Right now, we have Google's Notebook LM as a small example of this. Are you familiar with that application?
No, I'm not. Unfortunately, I only use ChatGPT. That's the only one I pretty much know. And I know Gemini, which is the Google one and stuff like that, which I think Google uses their search engines on, I believe.
Yeah. So Notebook LM is this little beta program, and you can upload a piece of content, and the GPT will examine that content, and then it will prepare a 1 to 2 person, depending on what you choose, hosted podcast on the material. And so it's an oral presentation reviewing the material, and you as the learner can enter the conversation at any point and redirect, ask questions, ask for specific examples, and the host will generate that based on this content, and would be an extraordinarily powerful way for a dyslexic learner to access and review information in preparation for studying or testing. But just one example of being able to dynamically format a piece of training based on some base content. Pretty exciting.
Okay, so what role does leadership play, and how can leaders be prepared to create culture shifts towards neuroinclusion across organizations?
Leadership provides a critical role. Neuroinclusion, any inclusion work involves change management, and change must be influenced top down in organizations. There must be a leader that's a champion of maintaining this heading of reporting back progress and adjusting goals and campaigning to stakeholders and energizing teams to continue to lean into the work of change for the benefit of all, right? When we don't have leader champions, we may see ad hoc pockets of inclusion effort. It'll be inconsistently applied to the organization. And we tend to see like a diversion back to teams being pressed to do more with less, right? And humans will do what's easiest to get, across that milestone finish line, right? And so people do what they're incentivized to do that's aligned with goals that are meaningful to them. So leaders have to take up that role, take that seriously, and really be strategic around that. I've been a research chair for IACET, the International Accreditors organization. We crafted this info brief that has some information for how organizations can operationalize neural inclusion. It's in that's in that paper. I'm happy to share more information about that if you're interested.
Okay. So what changes to hiring, onboarding, and early career training are necessary to ensure neurodivergent individuals are not excluded from the talent pipeline?
This is another biggie. I really want to highly recommend Victoria Honeyborn's book, The Neurodiverse Workplace. It's a really good resource for employers on this topic. Checklists, easily accessible, really good stuff. But it begins from recruitment. It begins from writing the job description and the posting so that you're signaling whether this is a safe place for neurodivergent professionals to apply, right? We've got to eliminate jargon. We've got to be specific about what the working conditions and expectations are, and think about how the application form and process itself is a means of inclusion for neurodivergent professionals. We can think about the hiring process and whether we are embracing inclusive interview practices, offering questions in advance, making the questions relevant to the role, right? Considering whether timed tests or all of the steps in a hiring process are actually necessary. There are a lot of things that we can do to just reflect on whether there are some unintentional discriminatory practices in hiring. Of course, onboarding is essential, and it's really important that we make sure that instructions are clear, expectations are absolutely crystal. Perhaps give a physical tour and a map of a corporate campus. Make daily routines and norms and procedures explicit rather than implicit. We don't want any unwritten rules, right? We want to explain all the rules. And while training is important, I think what's essential is that an organization is addressing across the board their communication structures, their norms, work structures, environments, policies and processes that have been constructed for neurotypical wants and needs to ensure that they're shifted to a more inclusive place. But I think that there are these are structural and operational things that we can really examine and find quick wins in. But there are deeper considerations, and I want to lay one on you, if that's all right.
Mm. Yeah, go
These
for it.
Okay, awesome. Um, for neurodivergent professionals to be their best selves, for them to show up authentically, to do the work that they want to contribute, because everybody wants to do their best. One thing we need to think through is uncoupling productivity and time. We got to realize that the number of hours that one works does not equal their highest quality contribution. Right? For example, a 40-hour week it is difficult for most, but impossible for some autistic professionals. But autistic pros have so much expertise. They have so much talent, so much ability to offer, so much competency that they can contribute. But as long as we measure a job primarily by time, and we still are often paying autistic talent less on the dollar per hour, we're never going to close the gap, right? That might allow autistic adults to make their unique and powerful contribution to the workforce. So there are some bigger things to think through as well.
Okay, so what skills or mindsets do facilitators, trainers, and learning designers need to effectively deliver neuro-inclusive programs?
Yeah, I think, we could go back to the framework that I was chatting about. And I think some of the things that facilitators, for example, and trainers would benefit and really enjoy thinking through are some of the norms in our classrooms that we just take for granted. For example, we'll often open up a conversation and, we'll popcorn. Right? People can just pop up and add an answer, add a response. And we leave it unstructured so that people can take their time entering the conversation. That actually becomes challenging for a lot of neurodivergent professionals when there is no structure around turn taking, because we don't always know when to enter the conversation, and there can be embarrassment around if there's talking over or incidental interruption, and it just creates anxiety, right? So something as simple as popcorning can be transitioned into the first person volunteers to go, and then they select a next person. Right. And so it can still be informal, and a person can always take a pass if they're not ready to respond. But there are a lot of things like that we just haven't thought through the norms in our classrooms. But once we do, we can find, refined ways of applying best practices in facilitation and design.
Okay, so how do we balance flexibility to accommodate diverse learning styles with the need for standardization, consistency, and measuring outcomes?
This is a tricky one, I'll say, but it's a challenge because we've normed standardization, right? Standardization is convenient for educators, it's convenient for organizations, but even a refined standardized curriculum doesn't always produce consistent results because there are variables in the learners, right? So setting aside K-12 from this conversation, because primary and secondary school have different goals than workforce development, and setting aside university structures, they also are a different animal. In workforce development, skills and capability are the goal. We need to understand fundamental knowledge. We need that base in order to do something new, different, or better. And right now, in our global workforce, skills are primary. We're talking about competence and proficiency and mastery. But how do we acquire skills? How do you become good at something that you're really good at? There is typically a sequence of steps to take at first, as you're apprenticing into a new practice or a skill. But then skill development happens by applying what you've learned to novel conditions. It happens by trying and failing, refining your approach, trying again, seeing what works better, maybe picking up a few tips to incorporate into your practice, and so on. So skill development is iterative, and it won't look the same for everyone. So going back to standardization, it's challenging to measure success of skill development through standardization. right, of a process. Skill development for workforce development requires, of course, the fundamentals, which is usually what we base standardized measures on, access to experts, practice feedback while practicing, and then additional contextual practice. And so we're used to measuring how people get there rather than the destination. And I'd argue that we need to measure against the destination. And this allows for different ways of being. And I think that's a powerful way to learn.
Okay, so what are the legal or ethical implications that organizations must consider when implementing neuroinclusion, and how do these intersect with equity, diversity, and inclusion more broadly?
Well, this is, of course, going to vary by region. Different regions have different levels and specificity in their disability rights legislation. That is then, transitioned into law and into policy, which in the workforce then in a lot of different areas of the world where neuroinclusion is part of that, gets settled as a reasonable adaptation is what it's commonly called, right? And from what I've seen, from what I've read, the UK seems to be further along than a lot of regions in terms of disability rights and specifying supports for neurodivergent folks across the lifespan, from schooling, healthcare, workforce, and then supports if one is unable to work. The Royal College research continues to provide really insightful work around neurodivergent and specifically autistic professionals. Canada likewise has federal autism-specific framework, and Australia has done a lot of work on neuroaffirming care and neuroaffirmative assessments, which has a huge impact on the quality of life. In the US, we have a services cliff. After students graduate from grade 12, there's less support in university, should one choose a higher education path, and significantly less protections in the workforce. I wouldn't say that we're an exemplar in disability or neuroinclusion protections at the moment. And it's no secret that how that transitions into greater equity, diversity, and inclusion is subject to prevailing attitudes. And right now here, we're having some challenges in that conversation to ensure that everyone is included. But going back to our leadership conversation, we need leadership that values everyone belonging, right? We need government for the people and by the people that will actually be for and by all the people, because only then can we be great. And so it's an evolving conversation, and something that we should be vocal about, the fact that everyone belongs, because when we allow for exclusion and for discrimination, ultimately it's harmful for everyone.
So what are some common pitfalls or missteps organizations make when trying to be neuroinclusive, and how can they avoid tokenism or superficial fixes?
Well, let's see. Let me give you some quick takes here. Well, one thing is making neuroinclusion a project instead of a strategic initiative. Neuroinclusion in organization is going to impact your teams. It's going to impact your products, your services, your clients. So it should be about who you are rather than a thing you do. Tasks are easy to leave unchecked, right? Strategic initiatives we track, we fund, we reinforce, and we celebrate. So that's one. I would say that if your organization is incorporating neuroinclusion training, that should be facilitated by at least one neurodivergent instructor, because lived experience, even as you've seen today in our conversation, is really essential in bridging a better understanding without perpetuating misunderstanding and myths. And I would say I recently read a study where a CEO of a large organization said, "I don't think we have those people here in our organization or among our constituents." And I just have to say, this is incorrect. You do. Neurodivergent people are entrepreneurs, they're business owners, they're designers, attorneys, business analysts, nurses, researchers, financial planners, franchise owners, musicians, educators, and that's just my family. Okay. We're
Fantastic.
everywhere, and it's a mistake to think otherwise.
Okay, so based on emerging trends, what might the future of I'll start that again, sorry about that. Based on emerging trends, what might the future of workforce development look like if neuroinclusion becomes standard, and what innovations or shifts do we need to anticipate?
Mm. I think that, for what the future looks like is everyone belonging, is just, expanding the tent. It means active inclusion, welcoming everyone, and that's something that we can extend beyond, neurodiversity. I think inclusion is a strength, but some of the biggest shifts that need to be made are actually internal. I would say how we think about it, how we talk about it, how we treat people that are different from us. Realizing that neurodivergence is not a disease. It's not a disease state, yet we apply disease state deficit language to it because of diagnostic criteria, and that impacts how people think about and treat neurodivergent people. I'd say when we realize that barriers are in structures, institutions, norms, processes, even programs that we design, not in people, then we have the opportunity to co-create a world where all learners belong, where everyone can be their authentic self and make their best contribution.
And one last question that we'd like to ask every guest here on the Deep Dive podcast. If there's one bit of advice that you'd like to give in 30 seconds or less, what would that be?
One piece of advice. I would say embrace change as an adventure. I think a lot of people, when they're embarking on inclusion work, can feel reticent because they feel like they might get negative feedback. And I ask people to embrace with curiosity the work that goes into the learning curve of inclusion. Change is work, learning is work, and this is something that we're in together. And just to allow that feedback to be an opportunity for you to learn and grow, and not something that's taken personally, but because someone has shared that with you, that means they feel safe and have entrusted you with that intelligence in order to make your learning programs better for everyone.
Okay, and on that note, Tracy King, thank you so much for being part of the Deep Dive podcast today.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
To find out more, go to inspired-ed.com.